The disaster at Sittang Bridge swept away the last hope that Burma could remain in British hands. Not only did the 17th Indian Division lose almost two-thirds of its infantry, but it also lost all transport, heavy weapons and large quantities of ammunition and other supplies. This vital unit for the defense of Burma was now on the verge of being destroyed, while the troops' morale hit rock bottom. Up north, the 1st Burma Division, with the 2nd Burma Brigade back under its command, became engaged in the first skirmishes with Burmese insurgents, led by Japanese officers. After witnessing the condition of the troops following the Sittang disaster, on February 24, 1942, General Hutton ordered the remnants of the 17th Indian Division to pull back and occupy positions along the road leading to Rangoon, to recover and reorganize. The 48th Brigade, the division's main body, moved to Pegu, and what was left of the 16th Brigade, now reduced to a size of a single battalion, and with sufficient weapons to arm a little less than 2 infantry companies, moved further south to Hulk. The division's 3rd Brigade, the 46th, ceased to exist, and its few survivors had to be redistributed among other units. To provide a protective screen, behind which the battered 17th Indian Division could rest and reorganize, Hutton sent a small detachment of a newly arrived 7th Armored Brigade, commanded by Brigadier John Anstice, consisting of the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, the elements of the 1st Battalion of the West Yorkshire Regiment, and the 1st Battalion of Scottish Rifles, the Cameronians, previously assigned to protect coastline south of Rangoon, to move north and take positions along the main road at the village of Vorv. With the decision to block the road leading to Rangoon, he left a gap of some 50 kilometers wide, between the 2nd Burma Brigade and the 7th Armored Brigade, open for the advancing Japanese to exploit, and, at the same time, by moving 2 infantry battalions to Vorv, he left the shoreline fully undefended, and vulnerable to potential landings and attack from the sea. Besides, as he had no doubts that the battle on Sittang sealed the fate of Rangoon, and therefore, confident that the city could not be held, he began with preparations for the evacuation and demolition of the port facilities. In the meantime, after suffering one defeat after another, on February 23, Obdacom Command met its inglorious end, when the headquarters was finally closed down. On February 25, General Sir Archibald Wavell returned to Delhi to resume his appointment as Commander-in-Chief of India, bringing Burma again under his command. And once more, in less than 16 months, the country's defense moved under the control of 5th separate headquarters, none of which, until this last one, had a clear understanding of local difficulties. Now entirely focused only on the problems facing Burma, on March 1, Wavell arrived in the country to meet with General Hutton, Smith and other Army and Air Force commanders, frustrated and highly unsatisfied with the current situation, holding both generals responsible for the recent disasters. On this occasion, he sacked the seriously ill General Smith from the command of the 17th Indian Division, replacing him with the division's former Chief of Staff, Brigadier David Cowan. With this move, Smith's career as the commanding officer was over, as he received no further posts. A few days later, General Hutton would experience a similar fate. Having no confidence in current commanders, in late February, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent his favourite general, ubiquitous Harold Alexander, to replace Hutton as commander of British forces in Burma. Upon his arrival, on March 4, General Alexander, having no clear picture of the magnitude of the disaster at Sittang, immediately cancelled some of the Hutton's orders, determined to hold Rangoon at all costs, the city which was by then a ghost town, as the Burmese civilians vanished in large numbers, while the Indian police abandoned their posts. In parallel with these events, the Japanese continued with an unstoppable advance. After mopping up British and Indian troops trapped on the east bank of the Sittang River, and quick rest, in late February leading units of the 15th Army began crossing Sittang, by ferry or small boats at Kunzake, north of the demolished railway bridge, facing no opposition, rushing south to their main objective, Rangoon, confident that the British will defend the city to the last man. The 33rd Division moved undetected westwards through the jungle, aiming to cut the Rangoon Prome Road, the main escape route to central Burma, before swinging southwards, down the railway line to Rangoon. On its left wing, the 55th Division moved quickly through the wooded low hills by the shortest way, leading from Sitang following the main road from Pegu to Taukean, while the 2nd Battalion of the 143rd Regiment provided protection from the north and, at the same time, cutting the railway line running from Rangoon to Mandalay. The Japanese have carried on with implementing their already proven tactics, which gave astounding results the previous month, by keeping to infiltrate behind, or merely bypassing the British strong points and roadblocks, moving through the jungle, and completely ignoring their exposed flanks, without any fear of being cut off, ultimately causing confusion on the battlefield. The main characteristic of the Japanese soldier was his ability to move, live and fight without relying on supplies or roads, living on rice, and fighting with ammunition he actually carried. Even small parties, infiltrating behind British lines, were able to hold off a much larger force for days. The battle for Rangoon that followed would display all the main characteristics of this Japanese tactic. By the beginning of March, the 55th Division with its 143rd and 112th Regiment, swiftly headed south, tasked with assaulting Pegu from the north and west. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion of the 112th Regiment was to swing around to infiltrate behind the British lines, and cut the road to Hulk. On March 1st, after having heard that the Japanese were approaching in large numbers, and in fear of ending up outflanked or encircled, the small British Defence Party, after destroying a wooden bridge, pulled back from Vorf towards Pegu, where they joined forces with the 48th Brigade, which was still in no condition for offensive action, and therefore, it was assigned to hold the outskirts of the town, while the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, the Cameronians and the 1st West Yorkshires were acting in a mobile role, patrolling the open country to the east. The following day the 1st West Yorkshires, and the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, launched a counter-attack to recapture Vorf, but failed to take the village, and on that occasion, the first tank versus tank battles occurred. Although having similar characteristics and main armament, the Stuart light tank quickly proved to be superior to the Japanese Type 95 light tanks, and, in combination with highly experienced and well-trained crews of the 7th Armoured Brigade, which had been fighting German and Italian troops in North Africa for over a year, they inflicted considerable losses to the attacker. For the following few days, the battle raged on, as the British carried out several more unsuccessful attacks, trying to retake Vorf and Pegu village some 15 kilometers further west, while the Japanese, using the morning mist, continued their advance towards Pegu. During the night of March 4th, the 7th Hussars relieved the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, which pulled back to join the 16th Brigade at Hulk, and in the early morning of March 5th, the 7th Hussars attacked northward. Although locally successful, the attack again failed to achieve the final objective. However, during this operation, the Japanese 143rd Regiment launched a surprise attack from the west, rapidly capturing a railway station and establishing a firm foothold within the town, forcing the British to abandon any further offensive actions, and concentrate fully on defense. On the same day, General Alexander arrived in Rangoon to assume command from General Hutton, and shortly after he arrived, he realized that the city was impossible to defend, with the small and dispersed force he had at his disposal. Even after the arrival of the 63rd Indian Infantry Brigade, which just finished disembarking at Rangoon port, as the last major reinforcement that reached Burma, the prospects for holding the city were poor. Therefore, having no other option but to reverse his earlier decision, to hold the city at all costs, he ordered evacuation from Rangoon and withdrawal north, aiming to regroup his troops in the Irrawaddy Valley. At the same time, he ordered the 2nd Burma Brigade to move south, and relieve the pressure on the 17th Division, while the sappers began with the destruction of the city's port facilities, packed with Lend-Lease equipment, and oil refineries at Syriam. In the meantime, the 33rd Japanese Division rushed south, further west from the Pegu-Hulg road, facing no opposition. By March 5, the lead elements of the 3rd Battalion from the 214th Regiment succeeded in cutting Rangoon Prome Road, by establishing a strong roadblock near the crossroad at Taukean, while further east, the 2nd Battalion of the 112th Regiment accomplished the same after bypassing the British positions, and infiltrating to their rear, where they cut the road south of Pegu, in a place where the jungle was thickest on both sides of the road. After an entire day of intense close combat within the blazing town, on the evening of March 6, Pegu garrison began withdrawing, with Stuart tanks of the 7th Hussars leading the way, and only 5 kilometers southwest of the town, the retreating column stumbled across the Japanese roadblock, and immediately came under heavy attack. The Japanese unleashed murderous small arms fire from both sides of the road, and attacked the column with Molotov cocktails, trapping British troops in the narrow bottleneck, surrounded by thick jungle on both sides of the road, and without any alternative routes or directions to outflank the defenders. Unable to break through the Japanese position, the British had to stop for the night. With first daylight, they resumed the attack, and at 8:30 am, leading Stuarts of the 7th Hussars blasted their way through the roadblock and proceeded towards Hulk. However, a few hours later, the Japanese had reoccupied their position, just when the rear column reached the roadblock. Once more, the British rearguard had to fight for the next few hours to force the roadblock before the badly battered Japanese withdrew northwards to safety, and the road was reopened to traffic. The battered 48th Indian Infantry Brigade finally reached Hulk at 1 p.m. Meanwhile, the real drama unfolded in the vicinity of Rangoon. On the morning of March 7, the first units of the Rangoon garrison left the city, and began withdrawing northwards along the Prome Road, when, at about 11 am, they ran into a Japanese roadblock near Taukean, some 30 kilometers north of Rangoon. The elements of the 63rd Brigade immediately attacked the Japanese strongpoint, and soon, the tanks of the 7th Armored Brigade, coming from Hulk, joined the battle. By the evening, a column of over 1,000 vehicles, consisting of tanks, trucks and armored cars, which was moving from the direction of Hulk and Rangoon, and stretched over 60 kilometers in length, came to a sudden halt. Throughout the day, British forces mounted a series of desperate attacks, and despite their best efforts, all attempts to clear the roadblock failed. As the night fell, the bulk of the British army in Burma ended up bottled in a trap, and its complete destruction was now a distinct possibility. With a massive crowd of marching troops and vehicles, piled and concentrated in a comparatively small area, another British catastrophe in the Far East seemed imminent. Fortunately, due to the local Allied air superiority over the city, and the great concentration of light and heavy anti-aircraft artillery, only a few Japanese bombers succeeded in attacking the Taukean area from high altitude, causing negligible damage. On the other hand, concentrated Japanese artillery fire could cause significant harm to retreating troops, but for some reason, this never occurred. For the following morning, a plan of the attack was prepared, which included heavy artillery preparation, and in case the attack failed, orders were given for the force to disperse into squads, and make the best possible getaway to India. At 8:45 am, after a much shorter artillery barrage than planned, the tanks rolled out, while the infantry fixed bayonets and moved forward, expecting a fearsome fight, only to discover the Japanese had abandoned the roadblock overnight, opening wide a route to safety to British troops, already on the brink of being entirely defeated. The real reason why the Japanese troops removed their roadblock is still unknown. The most common explanation was that General Sakurai Shozo, commander of the 33rd Japanese Division, lacking a clear picture of the opportunity which presented itself, did not realize the extent of the victory he could have won. Determined above all else to take Rangoon, Shozo expected the British would defend the city with all they had, so he intended to group his forces for one push forward with speed in a single direction, instead of attempting to surround the city. Therefore, The troops guarding the strong roadblock set up at Taukean were there only to protect the passage of the main body of the 33rd Division crossing the road. Once they had passed, the guarding force went around the British left flank to rejoin the rest of the 33rd Division, which was just entering the northwest outskirts of the city, while the British troops were moving north through the roadblock, without being subjected to air attack or close pursuit. Anyhow, regardless of the reason, the road was now clear, allowing Burma Army to make the narrow escape, including the headquarters staff, along with General Alexander, who was able to continue his notable career, while the Japanese failed to accomplish another victory, like the one they had achieved at Singapore. Around midday on March 8, the 215th Infantry Regiment of the Japanese 33rd Division entered Rangoon, and to their surprise, found the city completely deserted. The British forces may have managed to get away without being destroyed, but without this crucial port, they were now cut off from any outside support, and had no way to bring in more reinforcements. By the evening of March 11, the British forces completed their withdrawal to the Irrawaddy Valley, without any Japanese interference. After almost 2 months of constant combat, both sides were already exhausted, and badly needed the rest. Therefore, a period of comparative quiet followed the battle for Rangoon, and both sides used this time to reorganize. The British had realized that the command structure as it was before was ineffective, so they decided to group all units in Burma under a single corps headquarters, and Wavell had the right man to lead it. On March 13, Lieutenant General William Slim, who previously commanded the 10th Indian Division in Iraq, which had fought skirmishes during the Iraq Rebellion, arrived in Burma to take over the command of the 1st Burma Corps, better known as Burkorps. Slim was an unorthodox officer, and unlike many other officers of the British Army, he was less dependent on maintaining the line and linear fighting. During his time in Africa and the Middle East, he gathered experience in guerrilla warfare and war without a clear front line, and he would perfect it even more during his time in Burma, becoming the military genius of the Burma campaign. Besides Slim, Wavell called another officer he knew from his service in the Middle East, and who would also play a significant role for the rest of the campaign in Burma, an eccentric major he intended to assign to train the Chinese in guerrilla warfare, Ord Wingate. Once established, on March 19, Burkorps consisted of the 17th Indian Division, reinforced with the 63rd Indian Brigade, the 1st Burma Division, and the 7th Armoured Brigade. The 17th Indian Division took positions around Tharawadi, while the 1st Burma Division was some 130 kilometers east near Tungu. Around the same time Burkorps was formed, the Chinese 5th and 6th Armies began arriving in Burma. As previously mentioned, each Chinese army was equivalent to one British division, and both armies consisted of 3 divisions, with the approximate strength of 1 regiment. The Chinese 5th Army moved in to take positions at Tungu, tasked to cover approaches to Mandalay, relieving the 1st Burma Division, which was now free to be transferred to the Irrawaddy Valley. The 6th Army was deployed further north, to guard the border with Thailand and Indochina. Both these armies were under the command of another distinctive officer, the United States Army General, Joseph Stilwell. Although Wavell and Alexander did everything they could to bring the Chinese armies under a single command, their efforts ultimately failed. Moreover, the Chinese had a complex command system, so even Stilwell did not have absolute command of the troops, since every order had to be approved by Chiang Kai-shek, which was far from ideal. Meanwhile, with the fall of Rangoon, the table had turned, and the Japanese were now in control of the only port in Burma. Shortly after the occupation, the port was back in operation, and reinforcements gradually began to arrive by sea. By the beginning of April, the 15th Japanese Army in Burma was reinforced by the 213th Infantry Regiment of the 33rd Division, and the 56th and 18th Infantry Divisions, transferred from the 25th Army in Malaya, and plenty more tanks and artillery. On the other side, In the absence of roads to India, the British could rely only on limited reinforcements and supplies, which could be brought in by air. One of the final reinforcements that reached Burma was the 1st Battalion, the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, transferred by bomber planes, and arrived in the country on March 9. Reinforced and rested, in the second half of March, the 15th Japanese Army was on the move again, ready to open the next chapter of the early stage of the Burma campaign, heading north, determined to complete its task and seize the entire country.